So when you pull a fire alarm in a crowded building, there is this universal expectation of an absolute undeniable emergency.
Right. I mean, the sirens blare, work stops, people evacuate.
Exactly. The fire trucks rush in. It is, by definition, a rare and exceptional event, designed for total catastrophe.
It commands immediate respect. It is the ultimate break glass in case of emergency lever. If you pull it, something has gone critically wrong.
But I want you to imagine sitting at your desk, and that fire alarm just starts going off every single week.
Oh, wow, yeah, that would get old fast.
Or even every few months, right? Suddenly, the whole context shifts. It is not an emergency anymore. It just becomes background noise.
Yeah, you stop grabbing your bag to evacuate. You probably just put your headphones on and try to work through the ringing.
Exactly. And you might also start wondering, who keeps pulling the lever?
And why the building management hasn't actually bothered to investigate the underlying electrical wiring that keeps short-circuiting in the first place, right?
Yes, exactly. And if you are listening to this, you have likely noticed this exact paradox playing out in the news when it comes to royal commissions here in Australia.
Oh, absolutely. It's happening all the time.
Because the government literally defines a royal commission as the highest possible form of inquiry. It is something to be established only in rare and exceptional circumstances.
But it really feels like we are having them constantly now.
It does. They have morphed from being this terrifying institution of last resort into basically an everyday political occurrence.
And the statistics on this shift are actually quite staggering when you look at them.
Yeah, let's look at the numbers, because our mission for this deep dive today is to really unpack a massive stack of sources.
We've got legal analyses from senior counsel, political science papers, media transcripts, and even some public forum discussions.
Right, including a heavily political thread from the Shore-Friendly Geordies Reddit community. We want to bring all of this together to answer one vital question. What is actually driving this massive increase in royal commissions?
Right. Are they a genuine response to a failing system of government and, widespread regulatory failure?
Or, and this is the big question, are they just a strategic political tool used to manage media pressure?
Yeah, basically an expensive way to kick the can down the road.
Exactly. So to get to the bottom of this, we need to look at what a royal commission actually is, the incredible coercive powers it holds, and the deep public cynicism surrounding them.
And we're also going to look at a really striking recent case study of executive government failure to illustrate why these are being triggered so often.
So let's start with the statistics you mentioned earlier, because the rate of these inquiries is just wild.
It really is. So if you look at the rate of federal royal commissions between 1980 and the year 2000, so a 20-year period, there were 10 inquiries in total.
Okay, 10 inquiries over 20 years. That averages out to, what, one every 2 years?
Exactly, which feels somewhat proportionate for a major nation, dealing with occasional complex crises.
Right. It feels rare.
But then, when you look at the period from the year 2000 to the present, that number jumps to 16 inquiries.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, the rate increases to 1 every 18 months. And it gets even more concentrated recently.
Let me guess, it speeds up even more.
It does. Former political advisor and academic Scott Morrison points out in one of our sources, an SBS transcript, that since 2013 alone, we have had 13 royal commissions.
13. Since 2013. That is basically one a year.
Pretty much, yeah.
13 inquiries of the highest possible magnitude in just over a decade. I mean, that completely redefines what the tool even is.
It really does. It goes from a last resort to a standard operating procedure.
Which brings us to the anatomy of an inquiry. For anyone listening who only knows royal commissions from those tense, dramatic clips on the evening news, we should probably define what we're actually looking at.
Yeah, that's a good place to start. Former Judge Ronald Sackville provides a very clear framework in that SBS news source.
Okay, what does he say?
He defines a royal commission simply as an independent public inquiry established by a state or commonwealth government.
Independent and public. Okay.
But the key thing is he categorizes them into two main types, which really helps explain the shift we are seeing in the statistics.
Right, because reading through Sackville's framework, I noticed he splits these into two very different beasts.
Exactly. What did you make of the first type?
Well, the first one seems to be what I call the disaster autopsy. You have
Yeah.
massive failure, like a bridge collapse or, say, the robo-debt scandal. And the goal is to investigate that specific failure.
Right, to establish a timeline of facts.
Yeah, establish the facts, figure out exactly whose signature is on the disastrous document, and find the direct cause.
That is the traditional model, yes. The objective is highly targeted. It's forensic.
But the second category, however, is much broader. It seems way more policy-oriented.
Yes, these inquiries are tasked with looking at massive, complex societal issues. The Disability Royal Commission or the Inquiry into Aged Care are perfect examples of this.
Right, because they are less about finding a single corrupt official and much more about trying to reform an entire sprawling sector.
And it seems like that second category is where things get really messy. A government consulting firm called the Synergy Group published a paper analyzing this trend.
Oh, right, the Synergy Group paper. That was fascinating.
Yeah, they argue that royal commissions have shifted from being an institution of last resort to an institution of first response.
First response. That is a massive conceptual shift.
It is. They argue this increase is a direct reflection of a broader systemic trend of institutional and regulatory failure across the board.
So it's not just that society is getting more complex, right? It's that the normal tools of government are actually breaking down.
That's the argument, yeah.
I mean, if you think about the everyday apparatus of a modern democracy, you have the public service, independent regulators, ombudsmen, parliamentary committees.
There's supposed to be a lot of safety nets.
Right. But if all of those layers of oversight consistently fail to catch systemic issues before they become utter catastrophes, especially involving some of the most vulnerable people in society, the government basically has no choice left.
They are forced to pull that emergency lever because the standard machinery has completely stalled.
Wow.
We are seeing these commissions increasingly deployed to tackle what policy experts call wicked problems.
Wicked problems. I have heard that term used in urban planning and economics.
Yeah, it's a great term.
It doesn't mean evil, right? It means a problem that is just highly complex, deeply entrenched, and involves so many overlapping jurisdictions and conflicting values that there is no single easy fix.
Precisely. We are talking about decades of layered policy failures in areas like veteran suicide or institutional responses to child abuse.
These are not singular events.
No, not at all. They are intricate webs of systemic dysfunction.
Oh, okay, wait. Let's unpack this for a second because something isn't adding up here for me.
Okay, what's missing?
If these royal commissions are supposed to be fiercely independent and they possess these incredible investigative powers to cut through all this dysfunction, why do they feel so reactionary?
That's the billion-dollar question.
I mean, if we're deploying them every 18 months to investigate sectors like aged care, where advocates and nurses have been screaming about neglect for decades, are we essentially just using a sledgehammer to crack a nut because our regular tools are broken?
It absolutely is a sledgehammer. There is no doubt about that.
Right.
But the critical mechanism you have to understand is that while the Royal Commission holds the hammer, the executive government retains total control over exactly where that sledgehammer is allowed to swing.
Oh, interesting.
And that introduces the ultimate political leash, which is the terms of reference.
Okay, before we get to the leash, let's examine the hammer itself. Because the legal arsenal of these inquiries is extraordinary. They aren't just glorified parliamentary committees, are they?
Not at all. Their powers are derived directly from statute, specifically the Royal Commissions Act 1902 at the federal level.
Right, and we have a paper on this from Dominique Hogan-Doran, a senior counsel who has appeared in numerous high-profile inquiries.
Yes, she wrote a brilliant paper detailing just how vast and coercive these powers are compared to standard legal proceedings.
It's honestly a bit frightening. Like, in a standard police investigation, you have the right to remain silent. You have the privilege against self-incrimination.
You see it in American movies all the time, right? People pleading the fifth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Hogan-Doran's paper points out that royal commissions can often bypass those standard common law protections entirely.
That's right. In many circumstances before a royal commission, you simply cannot refuse to answer a question on the grounds that it might incriminate you.
Wait, really? If you are compelled to give evidence, you just have to answer.
You must answer, yes.
So they can legally force you to confess to a wrongdoing on the witness stand. I mean, how does that not violate basic legal rights?
Well, there is a trade-off built into the system. The specific compelled evidence you give usually cannot be used directly against you in a subsequent criminal trial.
Okay, that makes sense.
The legal system recognizes that it wouldn't be fair to force a confession and then immediately hand it to a prosecutor for a criminal conviction.
Right. But the commission still gets the information.
Exactly. They get the information, and they can use it to build their comprehensive report. They use it to establish the facts of the systemic failure.
And it doesn't end there, does it?
No, because furthermore, while it might not put you in prison directly, regulatory bodies can often use the findings for severe administrative actions.
Like what kind of actions?
Well, they might use the Commission's findings to ban you from working in the financial sector or the aged care industry for life.
Wow, so the coercive power is immense. They can force you to talk, they can issue warrants to enter and search premises, and they can seize mountains of documents.
It is a phenomenal investigative apparatus.
Hogan Doran even notes they have the authority to mount covert operations using surveillance devices.
Yes. And because they are not a court of law deciding criminal guilt, they are not bound by the same strict rules of evidence.
Right, because in a normal criminal trial, a prosecutor has to stay tightly within the bounds of the specific charges, right?
Yeah.
And prove everything beyond reasonable doubt.
Exactly. But a royal commission operates on the balance of probabilities. If they suspect a connection, they can yank on a thread, follow hearsay, and just see what unravels.
People often use the cliché fishing expedition to describe that kind of broad investigation, but this sounds much more specific.
How so?
It's like giving a detective the power to search your entire house because they suspect you stole a television, but allowing them to also penalize you because they happen to find a drawer full of unpaid parking tickets while they were looking.
That is a very apt analogy. The scope for discovery is enormous.
Which brings us to the catch. We discussed the hammer, so now we must look at the leash.
Right, because a royal commission cannot just investigate anything it finds interesting.
It has boundaries.
It is strictly legally bound by the terms of reference, which are set out in the letters patent issued by the Governor General.
And the Governor General acts on the advice of the government.
Exactly.
So the government writes the rule book before the game even starts.
Dr. Jill Shepard from the Australian National University makes a crucial observation in the SBS piece about this. She points out how this functions as a powerful political tool.
How does that play out in practice?
Well, a prime minister can stand up at a press conference, look gravely serious, and announce a royal commission. It signals to the voters that the government is taking a crisis incredibly seriously.
It looks like strong leadership.
But behind closed doors, the cabinet is explicitly dictating what the commission can investigate, the specific ways they are allowed to frame those issues, and exactly who gets to chair the inquiry.
And by defining what the commission can look at, they are simultaneously defining what is completely off the table.
Always. You might have a royal commission looking into a failing sector, but the terms of reference might strictly limit the inquiry to examining, say, compliance with existing laws.
Okay, so they can only look at whether people broke the rules.
Exactly. And by writing the terms that way, the government legally prevents the commissioner from asking if the laws themselves are fundamentally flawed.
Oh, wow.
Or if the government's own funding model is the actual root cause of the crisis.
That is a brilliant, highly cynical mechanism.
It is.
And we should point out, these inquiries are not cheap. Dominique Hogan-Doran points out that the Disability Services Royal Commission had an allocated budget of approximately $500 million.
$500 million.
That rivals the annual operating budget of entire federal government departments.
The logistics are staggering. You are funding massive legal teams, expert witnesses, months or years of public hearings, and document discovery on a scale that requires custom software and armies of paralegals just to process?
Okay, so if we put all this together, the dynamic is deeply troubling.
It really is.
You are giving a panel of retired judges an investigative superpower, essentially X-ray vision.
Yeah.
But then you are forcing them to wear highly specific, lead-lined blinders so they can only look exactly where the government points them. You spend $500 million for a deliberately restricted view of a problem everyone already knows exists.
And that tension between the breathtaking investigative power and the strict political boundaries is exactly the friction point that generates so much public cynicism.
Because it looks like action, but it's restricted.
It creates a massive, expensive illusion of sweeping action, while frequently protecting the core machinery of government from facing any true scrutiny.
Well, let's dive into that public cynicism, because it is a very real phenomenon. We have a source here that captures the mood of the public perfectly.
The Reddit thread, right?
Yes, it's a thread from the Reddit community Friendly Geordies, which is a forum heavily focused on Australian politics and government accountability.
What is the primary sentiment driving the discussion in that thread?
It is intense, palpable frustration. The original poster asks a very blunt question. They say, why does it seem like we sometimes have so many royal commissions and reports, yet achieve nothing?
That hits right at the core of the issue.
And to back up their frustration, they point to the aged care sector. They note that despite having a massive, highly publicized Royal Commission into the sector, there's still more than 1,000 cases of neglect reported each month in Australia's aged care homes.
1,000 a month. That is a devastating metric.
It's awful.
And it really highlights the disconnect between the fanfare of a final report and the reality on the ground for vulnerable people.
Absolutely. And the commenters in the thread immediately jump on this concept of the smoke and mirrors effect.
Ah, yes. The illusion of action.
One user wrote, "Looks like you're doing something without actually doing anything." Another called the entire process a sophisticated way to kick the can down the road.
That public perception aligns perfectly with what the political scientists in our earlier sources were arguing.
How so?
Consider the political reality of a crisis. When a government faces immense public outrage over systemic neglect in aged care, or the devastating human cost of something like the robo-debt scandal, the pressure to act instantly is overwhelming.
The media cycle demands blood, basically.
Yes. So establishing a royal commission serves to instantly relieve that immediate pressure.
It's the ultimate political shield. A minister can just stand at a press conference, face a barrage of hostile questions, and calmly say, "I won't comment on that specific tragic case," while the Royal Commission is doing its vital work.
It signals action to the public, but in reality, it completely delays the need for any immediate difficult policy decisions.
Delays massive budget allocations, too.
Exactly. For years, while the inquiry runs its lengthy course, the government gets a free pass.
But reading through this Reddit thread, I noticed another layer to the frustration. There is this massive expectation gap between what the public assumes a Royal Commission can do and what its legal mandate actually allows.
That expectation gap is critical to understanding the cynicism. What did they mention in the thread?
For example, people were absolutely furious that no one went to prison after the robo-debt disaster. One user, CM375508, wrote, "I'm still horrified no one went to prison after robo-debt. Criminally so."
And you can completely understand why they feel that way.
You can. Because if you watch these hearings on the evening news, you see department secretaries or politicians sweating in the witness box, being aggressively cross-examined by a king's counsel.
The staging of it feels exactly like a criminal trial.
It does. You are sitting on your couch waiting for the villain to be handcuffed and dragged away.
But the reality is that a royal commission cannot prosecute a single person.
Wait, they have zero power to charge anyone.
Zero. It has no legal authority to determine criminal guilt or sentence anyone to prison.
So what can they actually do with bad actors?
All they can do is gather evidence, make findings of fact based on the balance of probabilities, which we discussed earlier, and then make a referral to the actual authorities.
Like the police.
Right, like the Director of Public Prosecutions or an anti-corruption commission.
And once that referral happens, the regular prosecutors just take over.
Yes, and they have to look at the file and decide if they can actually win a case in a real criminal court.
Which is much harder.
Much harder. Because it's a court where the standard of proof is much higher, beyond reasonable doubt, and where all those special Royal Commission powers no longer apply.
Like bypassing the right to silence.
Exactly. A confession compelled under the Royal Commissions Act might be completely inadmissible in a standard criminal trial.
So all that dramatic testimony might be useless in an actual court.
Often, yes. Another user in that Reddit thread, Dopefish, captured this limitation quite eloquently. They pointed out that royal commissions are fundamentally just information-gathering exercises.
Just information gathering.
Right. They can't predict the future, and crucially, they are not required to factor in government budget constraints when they draft their recommendations.
Oh, that is a huge point.
Yes.
So the commission can spend 3 years investigating and then drop a massive utopian blueprint for reform on the government's desk.
Without a single thought for how to pay for it.
They can say, here's the gold standard for fixing the disability sector, without having to worry about where the billions of dollars will actually come from.
Leaving the government entirely free to respond by saying, "We accept this recommendation in principle, but unfortunately we simply do not have the revenue to fund it."
Or they can blame the states.
Yes. We agree entirely, but implementing this requires the cooperation of all the state governments, and we couldn't reach a consensus.
So the public is looking for a single, mustache-twirling villain to lock up. But the true culprit is almost always a massive, cascading, systemic failure of government accountability, funding, and culture.
Spot on, and that brings us to the centerpiece of today's deep dive.
Yes, the case study. Because if we want to understand the mechanics of how the machinery of government is failing so badly that we require a royal commission every 18 months, we need to look at a specific, shocking, real-world example of governance collapse.
And Associate Professor Greg Karn provides an incredibly detailed case study for this in his paper.
What does he analyze?
He analyzes the secret ministerial appointments made by former Prime Minister Scott Morrison between the years 2020 and 2021.
I remember this breaking in the news. But according to Karn's analysis, this isn't just a quirky administrative footnote, is it? It represents a fundamental breakdown of the system.
It was a massive breach of convention.
But let's walk through the mechanics of what actually happened. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Prime Minister secretly had the Governor General appoint him to administer 5 additional highly powerful government ministries.
Yes, the portfolios were health, finance, industry, science, energy resources, home affairs, and treasury.
He assumed joint control over these massive departments, but he didn't inform the public.
No,
He didn't inform the Parliament.
not at all.
And in most cases, he didn't even inform the actual cabinet ministers who thought they were solely responsible for running those departments, nor did he tell the department secretaries.
It was an unprecedented departure from the fundamental doctrines that govern our democracy.
It sounds wild when you lay it all out like that.
Karn's paper makes a vital structural distinction here that explains how a culture like this develops. He contrasts what he calls a minimalist political conception of government with the traditional institutional doctrine.
Okay, those are some heavy academic terms. Let's break those down. What exactly is a minimalist political conception?
It is essentially the attitude that as long as an action is technically, strictly legal according to the absolute letter of the law, then it is perfectly acceptable to do it.
Just scraping by on legality.
Exactly. It completely ignores the spirit of the law, historical precedent, or any democratic tradition. It's a culture of bare legality.
So it's like playing a sport by solely looking for bizarre loopholes in the rulebook, rather than playing by the agreed-upon spirit of the game.
That is a very good comparison because legally speaking, under Section 64 of the Constitution, the Governor General does have the power to appoint ministers of state to administer departments.
Right, so he technically had the power.
When the scandal broke, the Solicitor General reviewed the appointments and confirmed that, strictly speaking, Morrison's secret appointments were legally valid. The bare mechanics of the Constitution were followed.
But our entire system of government relies on so much more than just a literal minimalist reading of the Constitution.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
It relies on unwritten rules and conventions that make the democratic machinery actually function.
And those conventions are what Karn refers to as the traditional institutional doctrine.
Okay.
And the absolute bedrock of that doctrine in a Westminster parliamentary system is the concept of responsible government.
Responsible government.
Which means what, exactly?
The idea that the executive branch, the prime minister and their cabinet, doesn't just get to rule by decree, they are constantly responsible and actively accountable to the parliament.
And through the parliament, to the people who elected them.
Exactly. And the practical mechanism that makes responsible government work is individual ministerial responsibility.
Right, so if a department messes up, someone takes the fall. Yes. If a government department makes a disastrous error or implements a harmful policy, the specific minister responsible for that department has to stand up during question time in Parliament.
They have to face the music?
They have to face hostile questions from the opposition, explain the failure to the public, and if the failure is severe enough, they are expected to resign.
So when you introduce complete secrecy into that equation,
Yeah.
how does it damage that mechanism?
It obliterates it entirely. Think about the basic logic of accountability. If the parliament does not know who the minister is, how can they possibly hold them accountable?
They can't.
If the public and the opposition have no idea that Scott Morrison is secretly the co-minister for health, how can they ask him questions about health policy decisions he might be secretly influencing?
They literally can't. It renders the entire accountability mechanism completely unworkable.
Exactly.
It's like trying to play a high-stakes game of chess, but half of your opponent's pieces are invisible. You can't strategize or hold them to the rules if you can't even see the board.
Karn points out that this culture of secrecy wasn't just a momentary quirk of the pandemic panic either.
Right, because it started with health and finance, didn't it?
Yeah, the first two appointments, health and finance in March 2020, were at least tangentially related to emergency pandemic powers.
There was a fear that a minister might fall deeply ill, and a backup was needed to sign urgent biosecurity orders. Which, okay, I can sort of understand the logic there.
But the later appointments were completely disconnected from any COVID emergency.
And this is where it gets really murky. The appointment to the industry, science, energy, and resources portfolio is where this goes from being a theoretical, constitutional issue to a concrete abuse of convention.
Yes, because he didn't just hold this power as a backup, he actually used it to intervene in a highly sensitive decision.
Right, so the portfolio was known as DISR. The context here centers around a highly controversial offshore petroleum exploration permit known as PP11, located off the coast of New South Wales.
This was incredibly politically sensitive. You had an election looming, and coastal communities, including several key marginal seats, were fiercely opposed to offshore drilling.
So the existing Minister for Resources, Keith Pitt, was the statutory decision-maker considering an application to extend this exploration permit.
And Prime Minister Morrison had publicly stated he did not support the extension, clearly reading the political mood of those marginal seats.
But here's the catch. Under the specific legislation, the Offshore Petroleum and Greenhouse Gas Storage Act, the legal authority to make that decision rested solely with the responsible minister, not the Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister can't just walk into a department and dictate what a statutory decision-maker does. The law designates a specific person to make that call.
Correct. So, to circumvent that limitation, Morrison had himself secretly appointed to administer the DISR department in April 2021.
And the actual minister, Keith Pitt, was kept largely in the dark about the true scope of this.
The department secretary didn't know for months.
It's just wild.
Then, in early 2022, Morrison used his secret concurrent authority to formally refuse the PP11 application, directly overruling the intended process.
When you look at Greg Carn's analysis of this, it is deeply unsettling. You have a culture at the highest levels of leadership that is merely checking the box of bare legality.
They're looking at Section 64 of the Constitution and saying, well, technically, it doesn't explicitly state I have to issue a press release telling anyone I'm the minister.
They are willfully ignoring the entire spirit of democratic accountability.
And if the system is draking down from the inside to this degree, it forces us to ask a really tough question. Are royal commissions essentially just the government investigating itself when the culture finally yields a disaster?
Well, Kern's paper suggests that this insulated, opaque executive culture where immediate political advantage completely overrides democratic convention is the exact environment where massive institutional failure thrives.
Because no one is watching the watchers.
Right. When accountability is treated as an optional, inconvenient annoyance rather than a structural necessity, you inevitably get disasters.
Which brings us back to the robodebt scandal we mentioned earlier. That seems like the perfect example of this culture in action.
It absolutely is.
The government used a flawed algorithm to illegally chase citizens for non-existent welfare debts. They took a person's annual income reported to the tax office, divided it by 26 to get a fortnightly average, and compared it to what they reported to Centrelink.
And if there was a discrepancy, it automatically issued a debt notice and reversed the onus of proof.
Forcing the citizen to prove they didn't owe the money. It was an illegal, automated debt recovery scheme that ran for years.
And it was allowed to run because internal warnings were ignored, critical legal advice was sidelined or kept hidden, and ministers were shielded from true accountability through a culture of opacity.
And what did it take to finally untangle that mess and expose the truth?
It required a massive royal commission. The standard parliamentary committees and internal reviews just couldn't pierce the veil of executive secrecy.
Even the investigation into Morrison's secret ministries required an inquiry.
Yes, the Bell inquiry.
Which specifically looked at these appointments and found that the secrecy fundamentally undermined the principles of responsible government.
The Solicitor General noted that while the appointments were technically legal, they were entirely inconsistent with the conventions that form the essential part of our system of government.
So we see a distinct pattern here. A culture of bare legality and executive insulation causes a systemic disaster.
Which then triggers a massive royal commission to investigate the disaster because all other oversight mechanisms have failed.
Exactly. Which leads us directly to the next major question in this deep dive. We've established why these commissions are called. But when these massive multi-million-dollar reports are finally printed and handed down, do they actually fix the wicked problems they were tasked with solving?
If we look at the historical evidence presented by the Synergy Group and academic Kevin Davis, the short, somewhat depressing answer is generally no.
No. They don't fix it.
History suggests that royal commissions rarely affect long-term structural change to deeply entrenched policy problems.
Let's examine the evidence for that, because it is pretty damning.
Yeah.
Let's start with the Banking Royal Commission,
Of-
officially known as the Hayne Royal Commission.
This was a cultural phenomenon.
Oh, it was huge. There was wall-to-wall media coverage of banking executives admitting to horrific practices, including charging ongoing financial advice fees to clients who had been dead for years.
It was an incredible public spectacle. It felt like a reckoning.
But Kevin Davis's paper argues that the commission was fundamentally limited by its design. He argues it successfully targeted what he calls the proximate causes of the misbehavior.
So the immediate surface-level causes, the naughty bankers, the specific instances of fraud, and the poorly designed compliance algorithms.
Exactly. But Davis argues that because of its limited mandate and tight time frame, the commission completely missed the deep-seated fundamental structural issues driving the misconduct across the global financial sector.
It didn't restructure the foundations of banking, it just punished the most obvious bad actors.
And in some cases, the attempt to fix things actually caused new problems.
How so?
Well, the Synergy Group paper highlights one of the biggest recommendations from the Hayning inquiry: banning commission payments to mortgage brokers.
Okay, the underlying logic of that made sense on paper, right?
Yeah.
The intention was to stop brokers from pushing clients into unsuitable high-interest loans just to secure a lucrative kickback from the lender.
But the Synergy paper points out a massive unintended consequence. If a customer has to suddenly pay an upfront fee out of their own pocket to use an independent mortgage broker, what are they going to do?
They're going to bypass the broker entirely and just walk straight into the local branch of their existing big bank.
Exactly. The practical result of the recommendation was that it incentivized customers to return directly to the major banks, thereby further entrenching the monopoly power of the very institutions the commission was originally established to investigate.
It is an incredible irony. We spend all that public money and political capital only to accidentally help the big banks increase their market share.
It's wild. What about the Royal Commission into Defense and veteran suicide? That's an area where the stakes literally could not be higher.
This is perhaps the most heartbreaking example of the limits of these inquiries. The Synergy Group piece notes that the current Royal Commission into Defense and Veteran Suicide is tasked with cutting through an almost unbelievable backlog of past advice.
How much advice?
They have to review approximately 600 previously published recommendations from various reviews, committees, and inquiries over the last 2 decades.
600 recommendations that have already been made. So we are spending hundreds of millions of dollars to fund a panel of experts just so they can tell the government what the government has already been told hundreds of times. Only for this new report to likely be added to the pile of ignored advice.
It is an administrative and policy nightmare. The Commission is trying to untangle a veteran support system made up of 100 years of layered, complex, and often contradictory legislation.
It sounds impossible.
The sheer bureaucratic density is overwhelming. The inquiry is desperately trying to find a pathway for reform that the government will actually have the political will to fund without just adding yet another layer of compliance complexity to a system that is already exhausting the veterans trying to use it.
And if we look further back into the history of royal commissions, the long-term statistics do not inspire confidence at all.
No, they don't.
The Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody was a landmark inquiry completed in 1991. It made sweeping structural recommendations designed to reduce the disproportionate incarceration rates of Indigenous Australians.
Yet, over 30 years later, the rate of incarceration for Indigenous Australians hasn't just failed to drop, it has doubled.
It is a profound tragedy that highlights the gap between investigation and implementation. And the recent Aged Care Royal Commission. We mentioned the neglect earlier, but what about the actual report?
They produced a massive final report with 148 wide-ranging recommendations. But crucially, the commissioners themselves actually fundamentally disagreed with each other on several of the core recommendations.
Wait, they disagreed in the final report?
Yes, regarding exactly how to structure and sustainably fund the aged care system moving forward. They couldn't reach a consensus on the most vital structural fix.
If the independent experts who have spent years studying the problem can't even agree on the solution, what is the government supposed to do with that?
It provides the government with the ultimate political escape hatch. It gives them the perfect excuse to cherry pick.
Of course.
They can enthusiastically adopt the minor, inexpensive, highly visible policies that suit their immediate political agenda and simply ignore the difficult, massively expensive structural reforms.
And if anyone criticizes them, they can just point to the commissioner's own disagreement as justification for inaction.
Exactly.
So let's analyze why these commissions consistently fail to advance deep policy reform. If you assemble the smartest legal minds in the country, give them a massive budget, and grant them coercive powers, why can't they solve these wicked problems?
There are a few structural hurdles built into the system. First, a royal commission is generally limited to deliberating over information that is placed in the public domain during the hearings.
Okay, so they are restricted by public evidence.
Right. Their recommendations serve to clearly recast or reframe a complex problem for the public, but they cannot legally force a government to actually make the brave, unpopular, or wildly expensive decisions required to solve it.
It's like hiring a world-class architect to inspect a crumbling house.
Ugh.
They can give you a brilliant blueprint and say, you need to completely rebuild this foundation to save the house, but they can't force you to write the massive check to buy the concrete.
That is exactly it. But there is another deeply fascinating legal hurdle mentioned in the synergy piece that further hobbles them.
What's that?
Under the Royal Commissions Act, there are often strict exclusions regarding the admissibility of evidence concerning the internal advice provided by the public service to the government.
So if the government makes a catastrophic policy decision, the Royal Commission isn't necessarily allowed to look at the internal memos and advice the government was given before they made that decision.
Often they cannot. That internal advice is frequently protected under the doctrine of public interest immunity.
Why would that be protected?
Well, the rationale behind this immunity is that public servants must be able to give unvarnished, brutally honest, and sometimes highly critical advice to cabinet ministers without the constant fear that their private memos will be dragged into a public hearing years later and used to destroy their careers.
Okay. So it's a catch-22. We want public servants to be fearless in their advice behind closed doors, but by protecting that advice, we ensure the Royal Commission can never actually see where the decision-making process went off the rails.
Precisely.
They can't see if the minister was warned about the disaster and ignored it, or if the department gave them terrible advice to begin with.
It forces the commission to effectively put on a blindfold. They cannot fully diagnose the true internal mechanics of the political failure.
So what do they do instead?
Instead, they are forced to relearn the entire problem from scratch, based only on the external outcomes, and restate it, rather than dissecting the actual government dysfunction.
Which perfectly sets up the final phase of this cycle, the implementation gap.
Yes, this is where it all falls apart.
After the blindfolds are off, the multi-million-dollar report is printed, and the media cycle peaks, what actually happens on the ground.
Well, Scott Morrison in the SBS piece notes that there is evidence suggesting about 60% of recommendations from royal commissions are implemented.
On the surface, 60% sounds passable. It's better than half.
It sounds acceptable until you look closely at the mechanics of what happens next. Morrison highlights a fundamental underlying tension. A royal commission has absolutely zero legal power to implement its own findings.
Zero power.
The moment they hand over the final report to the Governor General, their job is entirely done. The commission is officially disbanded, the staff go home.
So the immense responsibility of implementing the reforms is handed entirely over to the government of the day, which is very often the exact same government that might have been heavily criticized or exposed in the report itself.
Yes, and as Dominique Hogan-Doran Senior Counsel points out, there are virtually no formal independent accountability mechanisms built into the system to rigorously track implementation over the long term.
None at all.
Very few. She cites a very revealing 2017 report from the United Kingdom that looked at 68 public inquiries held since 1990.
68 massive investigations.
Right. Out of those 68, only 6 were fully followed up by parliamentary select committees to systematically track what the government actually did as a result.
6 out of 68. That is less than 10%. That is an abysmal rate of follow-through.
It happens because governments have developed an entire playbook of political tactics to manage these reports, diffuse the immediate media pressure, and quietly avoid implementing the most difficult or expensive recommendations.
Let's run through that political playbook. When a government wants to kill a recommendation without looking like the bad guy, what are the classic excuses?
The most reliable excuse is cost. The minister will say, "We agree with this recommendation in principle, and it is a noble goal, but in the current challenging fiscal environment, we simply cannot afford the $10 billion required to execute it without raising taxes."
It frames the rejection as responsible economic management. Clever.
Another classic seems to be the jurisdiction excuse. This is a fantastic recommendation for the health sector, but unfortunately, hospitals are run by the state governments. We tried our best, but we couldn't reach a consensus with the premiers, so our hands are tied.
Passing the buck across federal and state lines?
Yeah.
Incredibly effective.
Or they use the bureaucratic delay tactic. We have accepted this recommendation, and we have established an interdepartmental working group to carefully consider the complex legislative implications.
Which is just political speak for, we are going to bury this in a filing cabinet, hold meetings about it for 3 years, and wait until the media cycle completely moves on.
Exactly. They know how to wait out the public outrage. And this brings us to an incredibly important point, connecting back to Greg Kern's paper regarding the broader international context of declining trust in democratic institutions.
How does the failure to implement recommendations tie into the global decline of democratic trust?
Think about the severe psychological impact this cycle has on the public. A government sets up a royal commission, very often in response to immense public trauma, institutional abuse, or systemic neglect.
Right.
The government promises the victims and the public that this inquiry will finally uncover the truth, hold people accountable, and permanently fix the broken system. They spend hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars to create a highly visible forum.
And vulnerable people pour their hearts out. Victims of neglect, abuse, or systemic failure sit on the witness stand, often reliving their deepest trauma under the glare of national television cameras, because they genuinely believe their testimony will lead to concrete change.
Yes, they participate in good faith. But if the government then shelves the report, ignores the difficult structural recommendations, or just cherry picks the easy, superficial fixes to grab a positive headline, what happens to the public trust that the inquiry was supposed to rebuild?
It doesn't just revert to the baseline, it actively plummets.
It deepens the cynicism exponentially. It confirms the public's absolute worst fears that the entire grueling, expensive exercise was nothing more than sophisticated political theater designed to protect the government.
It's devastating for democracy.
As Karna points out, we are living in a global context where representative democracy is already facing severe contestation, with a noticeable slide toward executive authoritarianism and insulated governance. In that fragile environment, using our highest democratic institutions merely as a public relations shield actively harms the core fabric of our democracy.
It's significantly worse than doing nothing at all. It is a profound betrayal of the expectation they deliberately set.
Exactly. It normalizes a toxic culture where accountability is reduced to a theatrical event to be managed rather than a functional, structural reality of how the country is run.
So we started this deep dive by asking a very specific question. Why are we seeing such a massive increase in the use of royal commissions? From everything we've unpacked today, from the incredible powers to the strict political leashes, from the secret ministries to the ignored recommendations, it seems abundantly clear that the nature of these inquiries has fundamentally morphed.
They really have.
They were no longer the rare institution of last resort. They have become the desperate first responders for an executive government that is grappling with massive systemic and cultural failures that its regular, everyday machinery is utterly incapable of fixing.
They possess immense coercive legal power to force the truth into the light, but they are fundamentally hobbled by the terms of reference dictated by the politicians. And in the end, they are entirely 100% dependent on the political will of the executive government to actually affect any real lasting change.
Which is exactly why this matters to you. The next time you're scrolling through your news feed or watching the evening news and you see a bold headline announcing that the Prime Minister has called a brand new royal commission into the latest crisis, well, you now have the context to look past the political theater.
You know not to just listen to the grand, solemn speech announcing the inquiry. You know to immediately look for the terms of reference. What is the government explicitly preventing the commission from looking at? What foundational issues are they protecting from scrutiny?
You also know the difference between a referral and a prosecution. But more importantly, you know that the real test isn't the dramatic, televised witness testimony on day one of the hearings. The real test of a government's integrity is what happens 3, 5, or 10 years after the final 10,000-page report is handed down. Who was keeping track of the implementation? Who was forcing the government to actually build the reforms they promised?
That follow-through is the only true measure of accountability we have left.
Which leaves us with a lingering provocative thought to mull over. If a royal commission is now the primary everyday tool we use to investigate a failing system of government, but that commission relies entirely on that exact same failing government to implement its life-saving recommendations, who is actually guarding the guards? If the fire alarm keeps ringing every single day, and we keep spending $500 million just to hire an independent expert to write a massive report confirming that yes, the building is indeed on fire, or are we just trapped in a never-ending loop of very expensive apologies?
It is a question that challenges the very foundation of how we choose to govern ourselves, and whether our institutions are still capable of self-correction.
Something to think about the next time you hear that alarm ring. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.